Good morning. If you're interested in making an advent calendar just like this one, then I have all the information you need in this video. Alright, starting with the fabric. Definitely shop for the sales. Every year, about 1 week before Christmas, Spotlight will have 60% off all Christmas fabrics. I think it's because they know no one can sew something that quickly before Christmas. And they are right. It took me over 2 years to complete this project, but don't worry, it won't take you that long because I made all the mistakes, so you don't have to. I grabbed a combination of red, green and black and used each design twice for the most part, and I had these left over from some shirts I made a few years back. I would choose only green and red for the pockets and save the black for the background because as you can see, the yellow is kind of horrible, but I couldn't use the other colours because I already used those. That was my first mistake, or second if you count starting this project in the first place. No, I'm just kidding, it wasn't that bad. Print off the free pattern on my website. It will also come with a fabric shopping guide in both metric and imperial measurements. Cut out the pattern, punch a hole through the buttonhole mark, cut notches at the fold line. Here I am tracing it many times onto the lining fabric, but the paper still got soggy, so fast forward for a second, I ended up laminating it and keeping the seam allowance clear. This was so much better. I then cut out all of the pieces. It wasn't until I had all of these cut that I decided to invest in a rotary cutter. Those things are amazing and are not pizza cutters hanging in the quilting section. I started by making all of the flaps first. 1 piece of Christmas fabric, 2 pieces of plain poplin. Plain piece down first, print on top, and another plain on top of that. Clip or pin together. Sew a 15mm seam allowance, leaving the top edge open. Snip a wedge out from each corner, fold over and press seam allowance. Then neatly turn inside out, then press flat. We can then add our 5mm and 10mm top stitches. Overlock along the top edge. You could just snip the overlock tails off, but I'm fussy and I like to tuck them in first. I have 2 separate piles, as you will notice throughout the video, because I am making 2 calendars at once. The flaps are now complete. We can move on to the pockets. On the pattern piece, you will notice a faint line that says keep main design image below this line. This is because the flap takes up majority of the top portion and you want to be able to see the cute fabric designs. With the flaps, I also set the design off center so the button wouldn't interfere with the image. For each printed piece, you will need 1 plain lining piece. Plain piece down first, printed piece on top. We're then going to overlock along the top edge, being careful not to cut off any of the fabric, and then tuck in the tails. Fold and press with good sides facing at the fold line. You can see the faint little marks from the notches we cut in the pattern. Sew a 15mm seam just on the ends of the fold. One of my metal rulers is the exact width of my seams, so I use that to make the folding of the seams quicker. With the lining side up, fold over and press both of the bottom corners, then the bottom edge. Pin or clip if needed, then fold in the side seams. We can now carefully flip the top fold back over, encasing the side seams. Press flat and sew around 10mm from the edges, excluding the top edge. Tie a double knot in the thread tails. With a needle, pull the thread to the inside, snip the excess, and you are left with a beautiful finish. Our 10mm hem is done, but unlike the flap, we will not be doing the 5mm top stitch just yet. All of the red pockets, black and green pockets. Here I am just figuring out spacing, but I will have all that explained on the printable pattern. This is where I realized that green pockets on a green backing wasn't going to work. I knew I was going to use some golden buttons and that there is a decent amount of yellow and gold on the pockets, so I went with this golden yellow cotton drill that was on special. Here I am planning the layout, making sure to spread out the colors and having no 2 alike fabrics nearby. Deciding on what buttons I want and where. Then time to sew them on. These are purely decorative and get sewn directly onto the flaps. These buttons were on clearance for $4 for the entire bag, so it's definitely worth looking around. This pile will all have golden buttons, this pile will all have red buttons, this pile silver, and this pile green buttons. Matching the thread color to the button color. Flip it over and pull the front threads through to the back. Tie them off, then pull the threads between the layers of fabric, then cut off the excess. Beautiful. Okay, marking out the panels. There are 3 different sizes. The 4 middle panels are all the same. The top is a bit smaller and the bottom panel a bit larger. Your bottom panel will look a little different than mine, but I'll explain that mistake I made when we get to it. Number your panels to prevent confusion. We will call the top narrow one number 0 because we are not using it at the moment. Fold the panels in half, mark the halfway point at both the top and bottom of the panel. Ignore the pockets for a second. We are now going to mark 140 millimeters from the center. This will be the center line for each pocket. Fold the pockets in half, place a pin at the top and bottom. This will help align the pockets onto the panel. Once they are aligned, pin them in place. We can now sew the 5mm top stitch that affixes the pocket to the panel. Pull the front threads through to the back and tie them off. Align the top of the flap with the top of the panel, evening out a few millimeter overhang on either side of the pocket. Sew along the top edge with a 10mm seam allowance. Once all the flaps are sewn on, we can start joining our panels together. Flip one panel face down onto the other, aligning all of the pocket center dots. Clip and pin together, then sew a 15mm seam. Open the panels back up, and with the seam pushed up, the flaps will lay perfectly flat. Repeat this for the rest of the panels. Press the seam towards the top while holding a bit of tension between the panels. This will help open them right up. Now for the narrower top panel that we numbered number 0. I had to unpick mine because I put the wrong side of the fabric out and there is a distinct difference between each side. Anyway, with another 15mm seam, it is all fixed. So this is the mistake I mentioned earlier and why your bottom panel will look different than mine. I have to add an extra bit to add enough length to the yellow, but you don't have to worry about that. I'm marking out about a 35mm border around the entire edge. For the backing, I decided to use the thick green fabric that I was originally going to use for the panels, but it's quite obvious through the yellow, so I am using a cheap yellow poplin between the 2 layers. You won't need to do this because you'll be using a thick backing fabric that matches the panels. Pin the 3 layers together and overlock along the borderline that we marked. Mistake number 8. Because of the weight, the bottom edge of the pocket layer kept wanting to sag, so I would highly suggest stitching in the ditch through all 3 layers along each panel. Time for the binding. I went with something that matches the yellow but is a little bit more fancy. I cut these strips at 75mm and will need about 3.5 of these strips to create the border. With good sides facing, lay 2 strips at 90 degrees to each other. Leave a little overhang on each end and mark a 45-degree angle across the corner. Pin and sew along this line, trim off the excess, leaving about a 15mm seam. This is when I finally bought a rotary cutter, and this thing would have saved me so much time during the pocket and flap stage. Also trim off these 2 pieces, open out and press flat. Sew the other strips on in the same way until you have more than enough to go around the entire perimeter. Fold in half with the good sides out and press flat. The diagonal joins prevent bulking by offsetting the seams. Start sewing on the binding below the 3rd pocket, leaving about a 35cm tail for plenty of room to join the ends. Placing the raw edge of the binding in line with the inner overlocked edge. Sewing a 15mm seam. When you get close to a corner, mark in 15mm from the side and 15mm from the bottom to get our stopping point. Sew to that point and backstitch. Lift the presser foot and bring the binding over, keeping this edge parallel with the bottom. Place a metal ruler along the side edge and fold a crisp edge back towards the direction of sewing, checking that this edge lines up with the fold underneath. I clip this fold in place while I spin it around to keep the corner as neat as possible. We have our 15mm seam along this edge. We can now sew a 15mm seam along the other edge. After we have all 4 corners sewn and are back to the beginning edge, sew about 40mm down from the last corner, giving us plenty of room to make our final join. Leaving a 5mm gap, fold the 2 ends back over themselves and press the fold. Pull these down and pin this out of the way. Open out the top tail, good side facing up. Now lay the bottom tail with good sides facing, aligning the ironed crosses on each piece, the 2 overhangs pointing away from the project. Pin along the crosses to keep them aligned, drawing from one corner to the other, then sew along this line. Remove the pins, check that the binding fits, then trim off the excess and press seam open. Now we can finish sewing that final edge. Trim away the overlocked edge and turn the binding over and around to the back. Take your time to shape and align the corners. I then hand stitch these temporarily to keep them in place. Switch over to an edge foot and stitch in the ditch on the front side, catching the back side of the binding as you go. You can then unpick those temporary corner stitches. Now for the hangers. Ignore mine that says pocket, this clearly is not a pocket. Cut 5 of both the lining and the top fabric. I've got 10 here, again because I'm making 2 at a time. Place 1 of each together, then fold in half with good sides facing. Then sew a 15mm seam around the point and long edge. Clip the corners and trim down one side of the raw edge to minimize bulk in the seam. Using a pen, or I ended up using a metal straw and a ruler, turn the hangers inside out, fold in the raw edges about 15mm and top stitch around 5mm in from the edge. Line each point up with the button below, then sew on a button connecting the hangers all the way through the panels and backing. Pull the front threads through to the back, tie them off and hide the thread tails. I ran out of buttons, so on either end I stitched in place, then added some specialty buttons. Fold the hangers in half, having the fold about 80mm long above the top edge. Clamp in place and hand stitch onto the backing only. A broom handle or some 25mm dowel would be a good choice for this. Instead, I chose to use a tree that doesn't have a single straight branch. Dragonclaw willow is beautiful, but not a good idea for this. I peeled the bark off, thoroughly charred them, brushed off the surface with a wire brush, and then sealed with furniture wax. Thread on through the hangers, and this project is finally done. And I really wish I didn't use yellow. Bye!